All right, we're going to move on to one of the more complicated bones. This is the sphenoid bone. It's at the center of the skull, and it's pretty much everywhere. We can kind of describe it as being everywhere because you can see the sphenoid bone from an inferior view of the skull, from a superior view of the skull, as we're seeing here. You can also see the sphenoid bone if you're looking in through the orbits of the eyes. And so it's really a centrally located structure, and it comes into contact with many of the other structures that we've spoken about and that we're going to speak about. So let's talk about some of the features of the sphenoid bone. We have the lesser wing. And the lesser wing are these lateral structures here that are kind of shaped like a wing, and they can be distinguished from the greater wing. So the greater wing is slightly more inferior and also looking like kind of like a wing-shaped structure that is giving the sphenoid bone its unique features. So we've got the lesser wing on top and the greater wing slightly more inferior. We've also got the sella turcica. Now the sella turcica is also called a hypophyseal fossa. This is the seat for the pituitary gland. It's also called the pituitary fossa for that reason. So the pituitary gland, one of our master endocrine glands, sits right here in this depression. And that's why we're referring to it as a fossa, because it's simply a groove or a depression in the sphenoid bone where the pituitary gland sits. We also have the foramen lacerum, another shared foramen, which is formed by the sphenoid bone, but also the temporal bone laterally and the occipital bone posteriorly. So here's our foramen lacerum, which is shared between the sphenoid bone centrally or medially, the temporal bone laterally, and posteriorly, we've got the occipital bone. So be sure to watch out for some of these foramina that are shared between several different bones, and you don't have to associate the openings with the structures that are passing there just yet, but be on the lookout when we get to the cranial nerve unit in the third unit. When we look at the brain, it'll be nice to go back and think about what cranial nerves are passing through some of these foramina that we would have talked about in this first lab. Continue on with the sphenoid bone. So we have another set of foramina here. We've got the optic canal. Now the optic canal is on top. It's going to be medial to the lesser wing. And this is allowing the passage of the optic nerve. So one of our cranial nerves, cranial nerve 2, which controls our sensory component to vision. Then we have foramen rotundum. Foramen rotundum is slightly lateral and slightly more posterior than the optic canals, and it's going to be closer to the greater wing. If we move slightly more posterior and slightly lateral, once again, we have foramen ovale. And then again, moving more lateral and more posterior, we have foramen spinosum. So a good way to kind of remember these four structures is think about the order in which we encounter them, from anterior to posterior or from medial to lateral, and they actually form a line. And if you think about them in the order in which they're encountered, that's kind of one way to associate the structure with its correct name. Another way to associate the structure with its name is if you look at the shape of the opening itself. So the optic canal is going to be the most medial located opening. Then we've got foramen rotundum, and the word rotundum actually means round, and we can see this is a very rounded canal or opening. Then we have foramen ovale or ovale, and that is, again, an oval-shaped opening. And then finally, we have foramen spinosum, which is the smallest or tiniest opening, and it's going to be the most posterior and the most lateral of these four openings. So it's really important for you to think about meaningful ways to associate the names of these structures with their function or with their location. And that's going to help make memorizing these structures a little bit easier for you. So don't just try to memorize them blindly, but think about something meaningful about the name, about the location, about the function. And that's going to be why I mentioned some of the clinical importance of these structures or the functional importance of these structures, just as a way for you to put some meaning to the structure and help you to remember it in the long term. All right, so here are some other structures that are found in the sphenoid bone. And I mentioned earlier that this is one of the more complex bones. We can see there are lots of structures, and we can see this bone from lots of different views. So if we're looking through the orbit, we can see the superior orbital fissure, which is another feature in the sphenoid bone. So the superior orbital fissure are these slant-like openings that can be appreciated superiorly if we look into the orbits or the opening for the eyes. This is also going to be an important landmark for the passage of some structures that we'll probably speak about later on in future labs. Continuing on, we have the pterygoid process. So this is a medial view. If you look at the view of the skull medially and inferiorly, this is the view of the sphenoid bone. We can see the pterygoid process here. Now the pterygoid process is simply a projection that's made of two smaller processes, the lateral plates, which are on the lateral surface of this process, and the medial plates, which are on the medial surface of this process. And together this forms the pterygoid process. And this is very similar to what I pointed out about the styloid process of the temporal bone, in that it is an attachment for muscles that help to move the jaw. We'll talk about the muscles of mastication in some later units, but they really attach and anchor themselves onto these processes, and that's the only importance of understanding these features.